Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So, the purpose of my talk today is not going to be to convince you as to why you should build an MVP. I'm going to assume you've all bought into that concept. What I'd like to talk about really is the different ways that you can execute MVPs, and also to discuss, or to dispel hopefully, a myth that I've heard a lot of people say, which is that, oh, MVPs are for startups, big corporates, big organizations can't execute building things quickly. And I'm going to show you a couple of real-world examples that, in my mind, show the inverse of that. First of all, why is there a Model T Ford up there? I think, to me, it epitomizes the concept of an MVP. Henry Ford had a question. If he could produce a vehicle that was reliable, robust, and cheap enough, would it be mass adopted by the general public? So he developed the Model T Ford. The first execution of the Model T Ford had nothing on it other than the bare necessities to make it function as a car. And it was only over time that they added features to the vehicle as it went on. So what are MVPs? If we look at the dictionary definition, minimum viable, i.e. workable, practical, and something that you produce by labour. Really, I think this is a better definition from the Lean Startup Handbook. And what we're talking about here is that it's building a version of a product or a thing which has the minimum feature set necessary in order for you to learn something. Now, what I'm going to show you today is that MVPs come in many different flavors, and I'm going to walk through some different execution examples and show you, again, real-world examples from brands that you may recognize that have used those to answer this fundamental questions. So it all starts with a question. The business, so as Henry Ford had his question, you need to sit there and think, what is the first fundamental thing that I need to learn? And that drives the MVP that you build. At its most simplest execution, an MVP can just be a landing page. There's two examples here, slightly different variants. The first was Stripe, the alternative credit card transaction platform. When they thought about the product, they had a question right at the beginning, which was, will retailers or merchants even be prepared to trust their credit and debit card transactions to somebody that isn't a bank? So before they went and built anything, the minimum feature set they needed to build was something that would help them to answer that question. And all it needed, ultimately, was a basic landing page website and some advertising to drive people there and say, hey, if you're interested in this new payment technology, sign up and we'll come back to you. That gave them the confidence to go on and start to build the product. But it answered that question for them. Slightly more complex was Oculus Rift. Now, they'd developed the consumer headset, but they quickly realized that there was a potential problem in that if they couldn't find developers prepared to create VR content, their headset wouldn't sell because people were buying it if there was content. So the question they had to ask themselves was, is there enough interest out there in a developer community for them to build VR content? So they put together the concept of the Oculus Developer Kit before they'd even built any hardware. They didn't have anything in final production and started selling it. And the volume that they've sold of those gave them the reassurance to say, hey, there are businesses out there that are prepared to invest to develop content. We feel that this is going to be a viable product. But essentially, all it was a slightly more sophisticated landing page or an order page. Slightly more in-depth example was when Dropbox launched. So if you take yourselves back, 10, 12 years ago now, Dropbox was not the first file sharing product on the marketplace. There were other file sharing systems out there, and quite a few of them. But the guys behind Dropbox had a theory, and their theory said, look, we feel if we can make the action of sharing files between multiple devices simpler and less confusing, we feel that we will be able to penetrate this market. But as you can imagine, building that whole ecosystem from a product point of view is very expensive, has a lot of components to it, and you can't just build one bit. You can't just build the phone client, or you can't just build the desktop client. You need all the components for it to work. So what they did was they put together an explainer video. So essentially, they mocked everything up and recorded this quite lengthy video. It's about 20 minutes, and you can find it if you go and Google it on the web. And that video walks through a number of different scenarios using this new Dropbox platform. At no point do they say that this doesn't exist. At no point do they say this is a mock-up. And they take you through some examples of someone coming back from holiday with and uploading the snaps from their camera onto their laptop, and then it's syncing with their desktop, and then editing it on the web interface, and then seeing the edited versions on the other devices and everything. They then jumped onto Reddit and started talking about this on Reddit. And over the course of a weekend, they had 20,000 people sign up to become beta testers of it. Now that gave them the confidence. It answered the question. Yes, people have an appetite for a file sharing platform that has an improved user experience over what's out there at the moment. And based on that, they were able to then raise the money and build the product. This is probably my favorite example. So this is what some people term the piecemeal solution. So back in the early days, there was a company called The Point. They launched in San Francisco, and the idea behind their business model was that they would help groups of individuals come together around a shared issue or problem. So it might be a neighborhood that wanted to clean up the street they lived in, or it might be some people who wanted to raise some money for a charity, various causes. But essentially, they built this platform that let these groups come together and then gave them a bunch of tools to communicate with each other. Problem was, it just wasn't taking off. It wasn't growing. They had a reasonable user base, but they just couldn't scale it. And one day, the two founders were downstairs from their office buying lunch in a sandwich shop. And they were chatting to the guy who owned the sandwich shop. And he was saying that he was bemoaning the fact that a Subway had opened around the corner and was taking a load of his business away from him. So they said, well, hang on a minute, we've got a bunch of local users registered on our platform. If you want to do some kind of deal for them, we'll send a message out and see if anybody wants to come in and get cheap sandwiches. So, okay. So they did an experiment, sent it out. Lo and behold, over the next couple of days, people came in to redeem these vouchers. So they thought, oh, we're onto something here. So they started going to other retailers in the area and offering them the same thing. And essentially what they were doing was they were coming back to the office every day with a bunch of different offers. They were hand-coding them into a spreadsheet. They were then putting them up on the existing Point website. When people were messaging them back saying, I want to take this offer up, they were going into an Adobe Acrobat writer. They were creating the certificate. They were mailing it off to the individuals, all hand-cranked. But it worked, and it grew, and it grew, and it became Groupon. But they used the tools that they had. They used spreadsheets, they used email, they used their existing platform to prove the hypothesis that was, if I have targeted offers, people will actually redeem those offers, which will generate additional business for the retailers that give those offers, therefore making it worth their while to take a cut on their margin. And it was only when they'd proven that they actually built the Groupon platform. This is kind of the inverse. So I don't know if you will remember Fred Flintstone and his car. If you looked at him from the waist up, he looked like he was driving a car. From the waist down, his feet are making it go. That's the principle behind Flintstoning. A couple of years back, these guys, Nutmeg, launched. You've probably seen advertising. At the time, they did quite a lot of above-the-line advertising. The idea that they had, or the question they had, was that they'd heard about this robot advice in wealth management. So instead of an individual wealth manager managing people's investments for them, an algorithm does it. So the principle being, I invest my money, I set some parameters and I let the algorithm make the investments and manage them for me. It's lower cost, so I can pass on that cost to the end user. But the question was, will people trust a computer program with their life savings or their retirement fund? So what the Nutmeg guys did was they built out an entire front-end user experience of this platform, and they launched it. And as far as all the customers were aware, when they put their money onto this platform, there was a clever computer program making all the investments. There were actually 70 people in an office in Wandsworth doing it the old-fashioned way and pulling an all-nighter once a month to do all the reporting and all this kind of stuff. But the point was the customers were unaware of this. And it enabled them to answer the question that they had that they'd asked, which was, would people trust a computer program to invest their money? The answer, by virtue of the people that put all the money onto the platform, was yes. So they were able then to invest that money in building out the back end of the platform to actually deliver against the original proposition. The final and most sophisticated type of MVP is what I've called a limited feature product. Now, you might look at Google Glass and go, hang on a minute, that's not an MVP. But you need to think in Google scale. Yes, this cost Google a few $100 million, a couple of $1 billion. But to Google, in the grand scheme of things, it's still an MVP, because the question they had was, we rely on search. How are we going to get our search product off of a small screen into the real world to increase our reach of search? Can we make our search functionality bridge into the physical world? So they created Google Glass, and it came with a whole bunch of unintended consequences that we all know about people being creeped out by it and everything. And it answered the question that no, they couldn't use that as a mechanism in order to overlay search results in the real world. So it worked. That's fine. They iced it and moved on. So essentially what I'm saying there is that there's lots of different ways that you can build an MVP, but the common thread through all of it is you have to have and understand what is the question that you are trying to answer. And then you choose the most appropriate execution, or first execution, to answer that question. But none of that will be worth anything if you can't actually execute it within the organization that you work. So I want to talk now about the experiences I've had of how you can engage different parts of the organization in the concept of building an MVP. So a little guessing game. Anybody guess what department that might be? Marketing. Now, marketing actually will typically be your friend, but you need to be careful when you're talking to the marketing guys, because often you'll hear them say, it's all right, we've done focus groups, we know what the customers want, we can answer the question. Or, no way are you putting that rough and ready thing in front of our customers with our brand on it. We've spent years building our brand's all about quality. You can't release something that's half-baked in front of the users. And those are legitimate pushbacks, but in my experience, if you work with the marketing team, they have a lot of valuable knowledge and information that you can harness. And you can normally get round those concerns. So we've worked with some very regulated financial services businesses where obviously there is a challenge to you putting something, a test and learn product out into the market, or an MVP out to the market with their brand on it, because, well, they could get, there's lots of serious issues that could come up with the FCA, etc. So we've created fake brands, we've done advertising, we've run Facebook campaigns using a made-up brand, testing the concept. Obviously, if the question you're trying to ask is, will our customers buy a different type of product from us, and the brand's kind of the key bit in there, then you can't do that. But as long as the brand doesn't factor in the question you want to ask, It doesn't matter. Don't put the brand on it. Surely everyone's going to get this one. IT. I'm sure there's some IT people in the room here. Actually, in my experience, these guys can cause more problems when you're building some of the MVPs that we talked about there. They'll be saying things like, you've got to build it on our standard technology stack. You've got to deploy it, we can't deploy something within our infrastructure like that. Often, the root cause of those pushbacks and concerns is they feel threatened. They feel threatened that we're coming in with our digital way of doing things, we're talking about different approaches. It's not how they understand, so they lock down and they play the security or they play the infrastructure card to you. Again, engage early with them, make sure you explain what you're trying to do. And, you know, we've just done a proof of concept, built a small MVP for a financial services business. And there just was no way on earth they were going, their internal infrastructure guy said it would take us 8 months to stand up this bit of code on our infrastructure. And we were like, we just need to run it for like 3 weeks and see if it works. So in the end, we just stood it up on AWS, completely outside of their infrastructure, but with their blessing. If we'd have done that without their blessing, then the wrath of God would have been put upon us and, you know, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you today. But we got them to agree. We showed them what we were doing. We weren't putting customer data up there. There was no risk to it. It was just to prove something, to answer a question for the business. And they agreed. Nobody ever gets this one. I struggled so hard to find a thing. Finance. So the most common pushback I've heard from the finance people is, no, tell us how much the whole thing's going to cost because we've got to raise a budget for it. And you say, well, no, this is going to be like a 50 grand thing. No. How much is the whole thing? You need to tell me how much the whole thing's going to cost. Or, well, why don't you tell us what you're going to deliver for this, and then we break it into these tranches and slices, and it gets so overly complicated. If I'm honest, this is something that I've been struggling with in corporates and larger businesses more and more recently, is the disconnect between the way budgeting cycles work and the way we in Agile delivery want money to be released to us. But again, I've worked with some individuals within organisations who have managed to come up with ways of presenting the argument to the finance people. Probably the hardest one to overcome with them is when they get wind of the fact that you're going to throw away what you've built. It's an MVP, we're going to throw it away. And they're like, but I'm spending that money to throw this thing away. Why don't you then build the next iteration on top of that? So getting them to understand that it's cheaper to build it and throw it away than it is to build it and try and evolve it in many cases is a key way to winning them on side. Finally, mustn't forget these guys. Any guesses? Yeah, excellent. I think the key thing to remember with the C-suite is that in most organisations, they are pretty digitally illiterate. They might profess to be digitally engaged, but they're not. They don't understand what we're talking about here. They don't understand what their customers are really doing within digital. So when we're talking about creating these small MVPs, throwing it out the door quickly, they just don't understand what we're talking about. And if they get wind of this second hand, that's when it can become a problem. So we always try and make sure that before we actually start doing anything, we get our sponsor to get us in front of somebody at the exec level, even if it's a 10 minutes, just to kind of warm them up to what we're doing. So, why do some people succeed when others fail miserably? I think there's a couple of guiding principles that you can remember. The first one is stay focused on your objective. Go back to that question. Don't creep. Don't try and expand. Oh, let's just make it do this as well. Can't we test this as well? No. We're just going to stay focused on what is the most important question we need to answer with this MVP and stick with it. Back to Henry Ford. The other amazing thing he did was build a production line. You're not going to do this once. You're going to do it over and over and over again. And each time you're asking a more complex question or the next question. And the MVP is becoming more sophisticated. Are you using a different technique? I think that the principle of we create an MVP and then we get rid of it and we create iteration one doesn't necessarily hold true if you're developing a completely new product. You have to learn many different things. So creating a reusable production line for doing this kind of work within your organization pays dividends in the long run. Don't leave anybody behind. This goes back to engaging with the business. Don't think, oh, we're just engaging with the innovation team within this company, or we're the digital business. Take the rest of the organization on the journey with you. He was famous for a lot of things, and one of the things that I think is most relevant here was that he challenged convention, he challenged the norm. I don't want to count how many times I've worked with established organizations where you have this institutionalized answers to questions. Because when you join the business, someone, whoever it was, hired you, told you, oh, our customers only like X, or they don't do Y. So then you've been in the business 10 years and you've always thought, well, our customers only like X, or they only do Y. No one ever actually goes back and challenges that convention. And that's part of our job, is to try and challenge that convention. And that's what often, when you're trying to look at how you're going to build this MVP and what it's going to do, you need to challenge that institutionalized answers that come up to questions. Big or small? So I've got two case study examples to go through here. One of a very large organization and one of a small startup. Now, a lot of stuff that you read or kind of anecdotally hear about is that, well, actually, you know, MVPs are great for small startups. They're developing a new product. Big companies can't do it. In my experience, I think it's actually the other way around. So we're all familiar with these guys. Massive organization. A couple of years back, we did a project with them where they've got a problem. That's what they do, along with everybody else. It's a race to the bottom, and if they're not careful, they're going to become a utility. They've actually realized that. Not all of the mobile phone companies, I don't think, have woken up, but O2 have woken up to that fact. And as a result, they've been looking for ways to develop new product offerings that leverage their existing capabilities and infrastructure. Rather than running scared, they've challenged it head on. And they've talked to their customers. And this is great. Their marketing team are really, really plugged in. They're fantastic. They've done lots of customer research. And one of the things that came out from the customer research that they did a couple of years back was that they have lots of data that exists within the mobile network about your phone and what it's doing and where it's going. Not the calls you're making, but physically where it is and where it is in relation to all the other O2 customers and how fast it's moving and all this kind of stuff. They have all this data, they don't do anything with it. And they came across the concept of these connected car insurance products. So anybody with teenage kids in the room will be familiar with the only way to get an 18-year-old insured on a car these days is to put this black box under the bonnet that basically tracks how they drive, and it says, oh, right, they can't drive after 10 o'clock on a Friday night or after 11 p.m. on a Saturday. And essentially, it uses a stick to beat them when they do wrong. O2 said, well, hang on a minute. Our whole brand value is about rewards, is about rewarding our customers for doing good. We've got all this data. We think we could deliver an equivalent level of tracking to these black boxes using the data on the network that we've got. We also think that actually, rather than beating people up with a stick for driving when they drive badly, we could incentivize them to drive better by rewarding them when they do so. Other great thing they've got, they have a whole customer experience team there. So our sponsor, on the back of those customer interviews, was able to go to this customer experience team and start working up some concepts for, well, what might a connected car insurance product be for O2? How might it fit within our brand? Is it the kind of thing our customers would be interested in? We started working with them, and together we built this balanced scorecard. Essentially, what we did is we said, look, we've got 2 questions we need to answer there. Will people respond to being rewarded rather than chastised for driving badly? And are we able to collect enough data from the net, or utilize the data that's sitting in the network in a way that will enable us to accurately track how people drive? So, you probably can't read it, but essentially what this does is we looked at a whole load of features that we needed to put in it and that customers wanted. We scored those against how much the customers wanted them. We looked at how complex it would be to build them. And then we looked at the cost. We weighted it all, and we were able to then apply a score which let us cut off at a certain point and define, well, that's our MVP features. We won't bother with building anything more from the MVP than just those core features. But it was done in a way that we could justify that decision to the brand people, to the finance people, to the board, rather than us just saying, no, we're just going to do this. So we actually launched O2 Drive. So it took 9 months from idea to delivery of an MVP app for this. And this is the product. It's all centered around this bit at the top, because the fundamental question was, how can I convey, there was a UX challenge there, how do I convey the driving data to you in a way that you can meaningfully action it? And if I do that successfully, will you actually change the way you drive over time? If I reward you when you do so. And it worked. They're currently in the process of launching the next iteration of the product. I don't know the current. I mean, within the first month, they signed up about 1,000 customers. So it was a successful enough product for them to continue investing in it. But for us, I think it proved to me that large corporates with the right mindset have a whole bunch of tools that you can utilize to help you deliver something like that. And just because they're a big company doesn't mean that you can't achieve it. Conversely, these guys came in to see us a couple of years ago and started this presentation. So this was 3 guys that had come out of the wealth management industry, experienced, had sold a successful wealth management company for a lot of money. They had an idea, and their idea was, millennials need help with their finance. We want to launch a wealth management business focused on millennials. And they showed us this kind of stuff. We're like, wow, these guys really get it. They're totally on the ball. Look at that. You know, they've got a clear proposition here. The question that they want to ask is, will millennials actually care enough about their financial services to engage in a wealth management product? Unfortunately, then they showed us this slide. And it was that statement there that scared me. And we realized that actually that's what their thinking was like. These 3 guys had spent 6 months thinking about this product. They had 1,000,001 ideas about what it might be, how it could work, what it should do. And it took an awful lot of work. And they said, we just want to build an MVP, and we want it to do this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And we're like, well, hang on a minute. No, trying to get them to peel it back to what is this fundamental question that you're trying to answer was really, really difficult, and ended up burning way more of their budget before they'd built a single thing. But for them, the MVP actually was a bunch of mock-ups that we tested with some people one-on-one in focus groups, clickable prototypes, mocked up. We sat for a week with a bunch of millennials coming through, talking to them about their finances and showing them these mock-ups and getting them to interact with them. And what that did was it enabled us to actually go, hang on a minute, half the stuff you guys think they want, they're not interested in. So that goes straight out of what you've got to build. Actually, what it comes down to is this fundamental question of how do you get them to care about their finances? And what you need to do is you need to build a product which hooks them in some way that gets them to start thinking about their finances. So, and it's funny, since I first wrote this talk, I've just started working with another startup a couple of weeks back. And it's like deja vu. They came to us, again, with a nice pitch deck. They've raised 3 million euros from a bunch of banks in Europe to build this idea they've got. But actually, they've got 1,000,001 ideas. And they're saying, we just need an MVP by October. It's like, but what are we trying to, what's the fundamental question that we're trying to answer? And we're just having the same discussion with those guys at the moment. And I'm about to go and do, and because I've done this now, I've realised we can shortcut to this bit. So I'm like, look, what we need to do, we need to mock some of this stuff up and put it in front of some customers immediately. That's your MVP. So that's what we're doing, and in about 2 weeks' time, I'm going to sit down with a bunch of customers, or potential customers, and do the same kind of testing. And that will be the MVP execution of what they want, what they're thinking. But the point is that these startups have so much flexibility and latitude that they can just go in all sorts of directions, and it's really hard to focus them. Whereas actually corporates have controls and objectives and year end, and they have many other things in place which focus people better on actually executing something. Finally, quite often at the end of this, people used to say to me, oh, what about prototypes? So I've added a bit onto the talk now, which I believe that prototypes and MVPs coexist, but they have different functions. I just had to put that on because I love that. That was the lunar buggy prototype, or one of the lunar buggy prototypes in the 60s. So the definition is a first typical or preliminary model of something. And I thought long and hard about how to kind of contextualize this in context of the rest of this presentation. And I realized actually that it comes down to this. Really, it's about stakeholder engagement. I've told you about going around and talking to all the people in the organization and getting them on board. But what are you talking to them about? I've got this idea, I've got this. So are you showing them a PowerPoint deck? What are you using to actually talk to the C-suite about or talk to the marketing people? Well, what you're using is a prototype. So I came up with this idea to say, well, if my ultimate product is the fancy donut on the right, then actually a blow-up rubber ring works perfectly adequately as my prototype to go around the organisation and get buy-in for what we're trying to achieve here. And then we move on to the MVP, and then from the MVP to iteration 1, iteration 2. But the point being that they have different roles to fulfill. The prototype is there to get the stakeholder buy-in and engagement. The MVP and the different executions that we've looked at today of MVPs are there to answer a fundamental question for the business that will decide whether it continues to go forward with this idea. So, in summary, MVPs come in lots of flavors. If you go out of this room with one takeaway, please have it be the clear objective, the question. What is it I'm trying to answer? What is my one clear thing I'm trying to understand here? Build a repeatable process. You need to be able to do this over and over again. Stakeholder engagement. Use your rubber ring. Bring everybody on the journey with you. Don't be afraid to challenge convention. and prototypes and MVPs are different. So that's me done. Thank you very much. Anybody got any questions? Yes. Yes, it did. But we didn't write them. We utilised some from a third party. Again, because for the MVP, it's like we don't know whether it's so. We found this company that provided the algorithms for all the black boxes. And we said, well, look, if we give you data, can you run it through? And we looked at their algorithms. They were pretty crap. But for the purposes of what we were trying to prove, actually, we weren't trying to prove, could we, if the question had been, can we more accurately track your driving than a black box, then they wouldn't have been a suitable thing. We would have written our own MVP, our own algorithms. But for what we were trying to answer, which was the carrot versus stick question, it was perfectly adequate to use theirs. Yeah. But if I'm going around pitching and trying to explain to someone, so my point of the rubber ring is that effectively maybe it's not the best of drawings, but it's a crude representation of the end product that I'm getting to. So when I'm going around trying to explain to the C-suite what it is we're trying to do here, I'm not going to explain to them what this is. I need to try and sell them on the big vision. So my this could be a clickable prototype. It could be a cardboard mock-up. If you were an architect, it might be a lovely scale model of your product, of your building, sorry. Any other questions? Yes. That was the O2 Drive. It's a good question. It depends, I guess, on there. The MVP that we were getting to was quite a sophisticated thing because there was no way that we could answer that fundamental question without building an actual product and putting it out there to get a number of people using it. I think it's probably an outlier. More typically, I would expect it to take us 2 to 3 months to get to something. If you're building a landing page, you could be there in a couple of weeks. It comes down, I guess, to looking really carefully at what solution, what execution you're choosing, and is it the most appropriate execution, or are you actually ending up building a full product when you don't need to? But for them, that was compared to a typical product development cycle of kind of 18 months to build something end to end. So it was still shorter, but it wasn't 3 months. But we did user testing. We sat in front of users with prototype mock-ups and everything in the interim of that, so we were able to get feedback for them on the proposition earlier. It probably could have done, to be honest with you, yes. Yeah, it could have been. It was very difficult because it was kind of a multifaceted thing, because you had to get the feedback of how they were driving in there in order for that to then change their behaviour. But the only way you were going to reward them was by hooking in some kind of reward mechanism. So all of a sudden you've got 3 things happening all at once. But we did strip back. So, initially there was like, well, we need to have a vehicle recovery thing. We need to have a roadside breakdown. You need to be able to edit your insurance policy. And it's like, well, actually, no. You can just phone, and we ended up with just a page that said phone this number. Because that's all you need. That wasn't going to help us answer the fundamental question. But yeah, I mean, with hindsight, we probably could have stripped it back a little bit more. It could, if you think that gives you enough confidence to go to the next stage. And that's where you might then scale it out and build multiple different MVPs. Go over the back there.
So you mentioned about getting paid product and putting on the market just to see if it works. How much effort would you say in implementation goes into
It's difficult, and it's one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do. It's, oh yeah, we'll just create a fake product. But actually, you're right, you know, it can be a way more time-consuming than you think. If it's a digital thing, then it's easier to do. I mean, we did something for a couple of years back for a utility firm. The question they had was, how can we get people to take an interest in their boiler when they move house? I don't know, how can you? So we came up with this idea of a central heating health check kit. So we mocked up some packaging, we took some photos, and we put a Facebook page up and did a bit of Facebook advertising for this, the concept being you move into a house, you phone this number, we send you this health check thing, you test a few things, and it checks your central heating out for you. Nobody was interested in it. About 5 people asked for them, and that was it. So we proved that it wasn't a product. But it took a bit of effort to do that, but it was way less effort than could have been expended if we'd have actually built the product itself. But yeah, I mean, it's not always as easy as it sounds to do that. Yes?
You mentioned market research a couple of times.
Yeah.
Do you see any conflict between what you've done building the product and research?
To an extent, yes, because often you find with these companies that do market research, they're either going to agencies who basically bring in professional research candidates who just get paid to say what they want, basically, you know, do this all the time. Or they have, like O2, have a panel of customers. So you can say to them, I want to speak to 20, 25 to 30-year-olds in Birmingham, and they can sort that out. They've got a couple of thousand customers they maintain on this panel, but there's always a bit of bias there. I think any information is good information. So I like going to them. I like doing testing with those guys, but I don't think it's a substitute for actually then getting to a wider audience of real people. So I think one more. Was there another one, or have we done? Yeah. It's a challenge that we've had where, so I'm working with a client at the moment where we're about to re-platform an existing product. And, you know, we're like, right, so actually, for the first release of this, what's the most important feature? You know, we're gonna dump all the other features and we're just gonna focus on our first iteration is gonna be this most important feature. And actually what you've got is you've got data, so you've got analytics from the current product. So starting point is to actually do some analysis and understand what people are using. But I think also you have the opportunity to potentially not release it to all your customers. Is there a way that you can say, well, this, if I'm going to focus on something on this particular feature set, can I target it to a subset of customers? But you are in the luxury position that you do have data. Okay. Are we good? Thank you.